When someone you love dies, you lose the ability to ask questions. You lose the strength to verify. You lose the instinct to doubt. Grief does that to a person. It strips away the armor you normally carry through the world and leaves you completely open, completely exposed. And in that exposed state, you trust. You trust the doctor who signs the certificate. You trust the people who come to take the body. You trust that the strangers now responsible for your loved one will treat what remains with the same care you would give it yourself. In California, thousands of families reached that moment and placed their trust in a single name, the Lamb family. It was a known name, an established name, the kind of name that does not invite scrutiny because it has been around long enough to feel permanent, like it belongs to the landscape. Families called the number, made the arrangements, handed everything over, and somewhere in California, right now as you watch this, there is an urn sitting on a shelf in someone's home. They believe it holds their mother, their father, their child. They have believed it for years. They have built their grief around it. They have spoken to it. They are wrong. And the Lamb family counted on the fact that nobody would ever look closely enough to know the difference. The 1980s in California were a particular kind of ordinary. Neighborhoods had rhythms. People knew the businesses on their streets, the pharmacy, the hardware store, the diner on the corner, and the funeral home. That last one was the one nobody liked to think about, the one you filed away in the back of your mind for a day you hoped would never come. The Lamb Funeral Home had been part of that landscape for long enough that it carried the weight of familiarity. And familiarity in the funeral industry is everything. When a family loses someone suddenly, a heart attack, an accident, a death that arrives without warning, they do not research their options. They call the name they know. They make the call in a fog and hand the responsibility to whoever answers. The Lamb family understood this with a precision that, looking back, suggests it was never accidental. They understood that grief is not a market in the traditional sense. It does not operate on comparison shopping or consumer reviews. It operates on proximity and trust. And the Lamb family had spent years positioning themselves as the answer to both. What nobody in those communities understood was what the Lamb family had quietly decided to do with that position. What plans had already been made. What systems were already in place. The trust those families extended was not going to be honored. It was going to be used. There is something deeply human about trying to protect the people you love from pain, even pain that comes after you are gone. The prepaid funeral account was built around that instinct. For a modest payment made years in advance, a family could lock in arrangements, guarantee prices, and spare their loved ones the financial and logistical burden of planning a funeral while falling apart with grief. It was, by every measure, a thoughtful thing to do. Families across California signed up for these accounts, not out of fear, but out of love. Elderly parents who had watched their own parents struggle, middle-aged adults who had seen firsthand how a sudden death could devastate a household financially, people who sat across from a representative of the Lamb Funeral Home and signed the paperwork with a sense of relief, with the feeling that they had done something good, something responsible, something that would protect the people they cared about most. The Lamb family accepted those payments, issued the receipts, filed the paperwork, smiled across the desk with the practiced warmth of people who had done this many times before. The money went into accounts. The accounts existed on paper. And then, quietly, the money stopped being there. Not all at once. Not in a way that would trigger any immediate alarm. Gradually, carefully, until the accounts were hollow and the families who had signed those papers had no idea that the safety net they believed they had built was already gone. When investigators first began looking into the Lamb funeral home, the financial trail was where they started. It is always where serious criminal investigations start, because money leaves marks. Transfers, withdrawals, discrepancies between what should be there and what is. Numbers do not grieve. Numbers do not get confused or forget details. Numbers simply show what happened. What the numbers showed was embezzlement on a scale that took time to fully absorb. The prepaid accounts, the ones those families had funded with such care, had been systematically drained. The funds that were legally required to be held in trust, untouched until the services they had been paid for were rendered, had been redirected. Spent. On what, exactly, was part of what the investigation would continue to uncover. But here is the part that investigators had to sit with. The families whose money had been stolen did not know yet. Most of them were still living their lives, assuming everything was in order. Some of them had already died themselves, their arrangements now entirely unfunded, without their families having any idea. The people who would eventually call that number to say their loved one had passed, those people were going to show up expecting a service that had already been paid for, and find that the Lamb family had no record of any obligation to them. The financial crime was enormous, and it was only the first layer. There is a particular kind of silence that falls in an investigation room when the team realizes that what they are looking at is worse than what they originally came to find. That silence is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is the quiet of people recalibrating, adjusting what they thought they understood about the case and the people at the center of it. That silence fell when investigators moved past the financial records and began looking at the operational side of the Lamb funeral home, at what was actually happening inside that building, at the gap between what families were paying for and what was being delivered. The Lamb family had been performing mass cremations. Multiple bodies processed together in the same chamber at the same time. Families who had paid for individual cremations, who had been assured their loved one would be treated with care and dignity through every step of the process, had been given back mixed remains. Not the ashes of one person, the combined ash of strangers. Read that again and let it settle. The urns those families carried to memorial services, the remains they placed on mantles, the ashes some of them had scattered at sea, in gardens, in places that held meaning. All of it built on something that was not what they had been told it was. The intimacy of that final act, the last physical connection to someone irreplaceable, had been violated in a way that could not be undone by any verdict, any sentence, any apology ever offered in any courtroom. There are moments in an investigation when a case stops being about crime and becomes about something harder to name, something that requires investigators to step back from the legal framework entirely and simply reckon with what they are looking at as human beings. The Lamb funeral home case reached that point when investigators moved past the cremation findings and began uncovering what had allegedly been done to the bodies in the family's care before that stage. Reports emerged of mutilation, of theft, of the physical remains of people who had been handed over in their most vulnerable state, being treated in ways that their families, had they known, would have found incomprehensible. These were not people who could defend themselves. They could not call for help. They could not tell anyone what was happening. They had been placed in the care of the Lamb family by people who loved them, and that placement had been used against them. And then there was one final element that reframed the entire operation. Investigators found evidence suggesting that members of the Lamb family had arranged for threats against competitors, people who ran other funeral homes in the area. people who may have been asking questions or simply operating in the same space. The Lamb family allegedly did not want competition, and they had decided to address that problem in a way that removed any remaining possibility that this was a story about a family that had made bad financial decisions under pressure. This was organized. This was deliberate. This was a criminal operation that had chosen the funeral industry as its structure because it offered the perfect combination of access, privacy, and the protection of other people's grief. Before we continue into the legal case, I need to stop here, because it is very easy in a story this large to let the numbers carry the weight. 41 criminal counts, mass cremations, embezzled accounts. These figures are staggering, but they are also abstract in a way that does not honor what actually happened to real people. There was a woman who spent 3 years talking to an urn she kept by the window in her living room. She talked to her husband every morning before work. She told him about the grandchildren. She told him she missed him. She found a way, slowly and imperfectly, to build a life around his absence. And then one morning the phone rang, and an investigator asked if she was available to come in and speak with someone about her husband's remains. She went. She sat across from a stranger in a government building, and she was told something that made those 3 years, every word she had spoken to that urn, every morning she had paused by that window, collapse into a question she could not close, a question that had no answer waiting for her on the other side. There were children who buried parents, parents who buried children, families who had already moved through their grief and arrived somewhere resembling peace, and who were then asked to start over, not from the beginning of the loss, but from a place deeper than that, a place where the loss itself had been altered and could no longer be trusted. Criminal investigations of this kind do not move quickly. They cannot. The scope of what investigators were dealing with, financial crimes layered over operational violations, layered over allegations of physical harm, layered over conspiracy, required methodical, documented, airtight work. One weak link in the chain, and defense attorneys would find it. The financial case was built first because it was the most documentable. Bank records, account statements, the paper trail of prepaid funds that should have existed and did not. This portion of the case took time, but yielded clear results. The money had been there. The money was gone. The path it took could be traced. The cremation findings required a different kind of work. Forensic evidence, operational records, the testimony of people who had worked in or around the facility. Building a prosecutable case around what happens inside a cremation chamber, proving specific violations after the fact, is one of the most difficult tasks in this area of law. Investigators pursued it anyway, because the families deserved an attempt. And the conspiracy allegations, the alleged targeting of competitors, brought a different level of law enforcement into the investigation entirely. By the time the case was ready for prosecution, the scope of it had expanded far beyond what anyone had anticipated when the first tip came in. Investigators who had seen serious criminal cases before later described this one as unlike anything they had encountered in the funeral industry. Most of them had not known it was possible for a funeral home to become this. The criminal case against the Lamb family resulted in an initial batch of 41 charges. 41. Each count representing a distinct violation, a family, a burial, a promise made and broken in the most fundamental way. The number was large enough that when it was announced, It required a moment for people in the room to absorb it. The prosecution moved methodically through the evidence. The financial crimes were established with documentation that was difficult to challenge. The operational violations were supported by forensic findings and testimony. The conspiracy charges required the court to look at the full pattern of behavior, not individual acts in isolation, but a sustained, organized operation that had run for years. The defense, as defenses do, worked the gaps, challenged the interpretations, questioned the forensic conclusions, argued about intent and knowledge and the limits of what could be proven with certainty. This is how the legal system works. It is designed to require proof beyond reasonable doubt, and that standard protects everyone, including the guilty. But here is what the courtroom could not do, no matter what verdict it reached. It could not return certainty to a single family whose remains had been compromised. It could not give back the years spent in conversation with an urn that held a stranger. It could not restore the specific, irreplaceable peace of knowing, truly knowing, that the goodbye you said was said to the right person. The court could punish. It could not undo. And for many of the families in this case, those are not the same thing. After the case concluded, California strengthened its oversight of the funeral industry. Prepaid accounts were required to be held in protected trust structures, insulated from the operational finances of the business holding them. Inspection requirements increased. The regulatory environment that had allowed the Lamb family to operate in near total darkness for years was revised. This is the part of the story where the narrator is supposed to say that something meaningful changed, that the system learned, that the families received something resembling justice and were eventually able to move forward. Some of that is true. The law changed. Some accountability was established. Some families received answers. But some families never came forward. Some families never found out. Some families still have urns on their shelves and have no reason to question what is inside them, and will live the rest of their lives without ever knowing what the Lamb family did. That is not a dramatic conclusion. It is simply what is true. The question I told you at the beginning that I could not answer, the one the courts could not answer either, is this: how do you grieve someone twice? How do you go back to a loss you survived, a loss you carried through years of ordinary life, and discover that the version of it you held onto may have been built on something that was not real? There is no answer. There is no framework for it. There is only the knowledge that somewhere in California, right now, a family is living inside a story they do not know they are part of. And the Lamb family made sure of that, deliberately, carefully, for years. That is who they were. That is what they chose.